Jixiang. My name is Miao Guang from Guangshan Institute of Humanistic Buddhism. Thank you for joining us on this very auspicious occasion. Today, we have the honor of having the author of the new book, The Buddhist Maritime Silk Road, with us online, Dr. Louis Lancaster, Emeritus Professor of UC Berkeley, as well as Director of ECAI, Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative. He's also a very cherished old friend to Venerable Master Xing Yun, the founder of Guangshan. Hello, Dr. Lancaster. How are you today?
How are you, Venerable? So nice. Thank you very much for arranging this. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book.
Thank you. We're also very excited about today. So thank you for making time to share your thoughts with us. Today, we're going to talk about your fresh off the printer Buddhist Maritime Silk Road book, as well as how it actually links to the new media exhibition at the Guangshan Buddhist Museum. This 5-year permanent exhibition is currently one of the main attractions at the museum and has sparked new interest in the history of maritime Buddhism. So far, an estimated 600,000 visitors have already gone through the exhibition since its opening in May 2021. Before we invite you to talk about the book, let's show a quick video of what the exhibition looks like for the audience.
Wonderful.
It is indeed an amazing immersive experience on maritime Buddhism. So if you're in Taiwan, please come and see the exhibition. Now, as the book is just fresh off the printer, it will take a while to reach the hands of those who are interested. In the meantime, we would like to use this opportunity to give you a brief overview of what maritime Buddhism is about by asking Dr. Lancaster a few questions. The first question is, Professor, what caused you to want to write about maritime Buddhism? Can you also talk about the concept behind this book as well as the new media exhibition?
Thank you. I admit to you that when I first began to have the idea for this book and for the project which has resulted in the exhibition, I was a little bit angry at myself for taking so long to see the importance of the maritime part of the spread of Buddhism. I went to South India for a conference more than a decade ago and began to realize when I looked at all the archaeological issues connected to Buddhism, that in India it really was a coastal tradition. And once I had that notion in my head and actually began to prove it by sending out teams of people to make maps of exactly where Buddhist sites were, that I began to work seriously to let us explore exactly what is the maritime Buddhist tradition. if you read most books that were written up to, say, the last 5 years, and even today, the only thing you'll find maybe is a sentence that says, in addition to the caravan routes, there was movement by sea, period. You get one sentence. And so I've attempted to try to start the process. And there are some really good scholars that I'm standing on their material. I by no means have created all of this material, but I'm trying to put it into a Buddhist development vision. And so it's been a really interesting, and I've been having a lot of, I guess I could say I've been having a lot of fun exploring and researching and trying to deal with exactly how this Buddhist tradition made its way from India to China and to East Asia by sea. And I've begun to, and still working on it, to only now begin to understand how significant that movement was and how that movement changed the way Buddhism developed in Asia. So it's been a long journey. It's only about halfway finished. So I still am hard at work on it. And I want to thank the Buddha Museum so much for putting up this wonderful exhibit of some of the images and things that we took with the work of Sarah Kinderdine from Lausanne, Switzerland, and Professor Jeffrey Shaw at City University in Hong Kong. It was the three of us working together with Venerable Ruchan from the Buddha Museum, who finally came to put together this exhibit. And I have to say, I'm very thrilled to hear you say that 600,000 people have been through it, far beyond anything that I could quite imagine. So it's an exciting time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We hope you're no longer angry at yourself, because we're very grateful to you for having started something of this scope and of this significance. We are definitely exploring a whole new area of Buddhism that's going to change our perspective of where we are today. And I'm sure the number of visitors at the Foguangshan Buddha Museum will continue to grow now that the restrictions because of COVID are starting to ease up. But most of all, we hope to be able to see you in person at the exhibition sometime this year or next year.
Thank you.
Professor, for me, having taken part in curating the exhibition, I had the opportunity to look at the new media exhibition and then go into your book. And one of the most important topics you've raised in your book is the Great Circle of Buddhism. The Great Circle of Buddhism covers two directions. One is the Caravan Silk Road in Inner Asia, which is something most of the world is mostly familiar with. But regarding Maritime Silk Road, it now is something new, something we're about to understand, and just like you've said, with very little information and a lot to be discovered. So my next question is, how does your book tie the Maritime Silk Road to the Caravan Silk Road in Inner Asia?
As you just said, and I'll talk about that perhaps again in a little bit, if we look at the so-called Caravan Silk Road, these were very important trade routes, to be sure. But I think that we have put far too much emphasis on it in terms of the overall history of the spread and diffusion of Buddhism. It was important, and I don't want to ever say that it was not. And in terms of trade and the way in which trade was done, yes, there were camel caravans and all of that happened. But when you look at the real statistics, you very soon understand that one ship carries so much more material than you could ever put on a normal camel caravan. So the Silk Road issue, in one sense, is, of course, the road carried many different things. We've just become popular to call it the Silk Road. And it's a nice name, and I like it. But there were many products being carried, and perhaps one of the most important of these was spices, particularly black pepper. So in a way, we could call it the glass road. We could call it any number of roads. Tea, for example, there were tea roads, rice roads. There are many roads. But I've been trying now to say, all right, there was this arc in Inner Asia, which for a time was very active and very important. And then it shifted. And what we see in Inner Asia, of course, are the ruins of the cities that constituted that particular trade route. It simply can't cease to exist as a trade route of any significance. Everything shifted in terms of trade to the sea. And also, when that shifted, so did that Buddhism, and the spread of Buddhism followed the merchants. And so that is why I have put so much emphasis on trying to understand that part of the arc that leads us from India to China through the seaports.
Yes, Professor, as we read about Maritime Silk Road, to us, initially, these were like the invisible dots that were existent but unseen. But now that you have linked them together, we're able to see how everything comes together through the routes of the merchants on land and by sea. But I'm actually quite interested about how the merchants managed to travel across long distances into unknown and dangerous terrains by sea and by road to actually spread Buddhism to far distant sites from India. How did they manage to do so?
I think that we've had a bit of a mistaken concept that somehow merchants would leave India and go all the way from India to China, either by sea or by land. But what we really had were not single journeys by a single individual, or rather we had circuits. A merchant would normally travel one day, perhaps, away from home on land, or maybe 2 days or whatever, but not many. A route that he knew very well. He would trade at both ends of his circuit and would return to his home. When it came to the sea, these circuits were sailing circuits. And so we would have an idea of interacting sailing circuits. Ships would sail from one port to another. So a merchant would go from one port to another port, but it might be hundreds of miles by sea before the ship came to that port. So that meant that merchants who were traveling by sea would have to have two homes. It's the only way they could do it, because once you got 1,000 miles or 500 miles from home, you had to wait until the monsoon winds changed and blew you back. And that meant it was a year-long thing. So I believe that that's part of what happened, is that these Buddhist merchants had two families, and they had home in both ports. And their families probably became some of the first Buddhists in these ports. And they carried with them monks, but the merchants themselves were not spreading the Buddhist teaching by themselves. They had to find monastics, they had to find teachers, and they also were happy to have this new tradition of spreading outside of India, because it meant that they had an organization that was being developed in the new port that was part of their heritage, and that they could trust it, and that it was a way to create a cultural environment in which they were going to live in this new port. So it was not single people making trips all the way. It was just these circuits, and one circuit interacted with another, and it worked.
Thank you, Professor. As you describe the movements and the circuits of the merchants, we can begin to see how the dots are now becoming connected through the daily needs or the simple rites of passage in the life of a merchant, which is quite interesting. And it's also amazing to see how then they become connected to the monastics in each of these areas due to their rising needs of religious support. And so this is quite new for me too, and something very interesting to learn about as well. My next question for you is, the Great Circle is an enormous area of the earth. Who was in control of Buddhism as it spread far and wide? That was my question, because the area and the scope is so far and wide, and there are various traditions, and it covers so many languages. So who was actually in control of this? Who directed the spread of this? And the second part of my question is, what can we learn from this lesson from the 21st century global Buddhist development perspective?
As I began this work and realized that I was following two lines of inquiry, one through Inner Asia through the caravan routes to China, and the other I began to follow the silk seaports from India through Southeast Asia, the islands off Southeast Asia, up into the East Asian ports of China, Korea, and Japan. And when I looked at it one day, I thought, that's a circle. It really is. I mean, it's rough, but it's circular. And then I had the idea, if we mapped Buddhism in a new way, if we mapped Buddhism from the perspective of mapping exactly where we find a Buddhist archaeological remain, Buddhist being practiced, inscriptions, texts, what would that map look like? And as you just said, that mapping covered the whole of of Southeast Eurasia. It's an enormous area that includes India and China and Central Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, large area. While I was working on it, I ran across a picture on the internet where somebody had drawn a circle that was almost the circle that I'm talking about. And they had put up the information, more people live inside this circle than live outside of it on the face of this earth. In other words, that began to tell me to think about this circle quite as a real thing. That the Buddhism which was within that circle was what covered an enormous area. And the amount of data that you have is the data for all of Buddhism. Time, place, person, ideas, philosophy. And it's far more than any one person can ever encompass and put all together. But as I thought about it, it began to tell me that there was a specific thing that was going on that allowed Buddhism to be what it was. Just as I said, not one person made the journey. It was done in circuits. 10 people with their circuits might have carried goods from one point to another. I realized when you look at the map of Buddhism as that whole area of Southeast Eurasia, there is nobody in control of Buddhism in that area. There is no one tradition. It is a great movement that is almost impossible to comprehend. But there was no pope. There was no one person who stood at the top and told everybody what to do. So part of understanding the spread of Buddhism is to understand how in the world does it operate in such a vast area over 2,000 years of time, with all the people and all the ideas and all the political boundaries and all of the issues that exist. How did it ever hold itself together? What was the glue for Buddhism within the Great Circle? And I think it's the same glue that we have with the internet. We have nobody who runs the internet. Nobody owns it. Nobody is fully in control of it. It's a whole system of systems. And so I've sometimes referred to Buddhism as it was a system of systems. And each of these systems had their own function and their own way of operating. So you had a local situation, and yet it was part of a wider movement. When I was working on this, I was teaching it in Hong Kong, and I took a ride on the Star Ferry, which I always loved to do, across the Hong Kong harbor. And I saw a fishing boat with a family living on it, as they used to do in the Hong Kong harbor. The fishermen lived on their boats. That was their home. And I thought, I wonder if they realize that they are part of a worldwide commercial network. For them, it's every day and what they do every day. And they don't know about or don't think about the world. So the Buddhism that was developed, I have used a political term, which is also a Buddhist term, mandala. That in the political mandala tradition, local groups arise where there is a local leader, and the local leader rules over a certain region. But they have a relationship with all the other mandalas around them. And sometimes the mandalas form confederations, and we tend to call those empires. And as you begin to look, you realize that's sort of the way the world works. It's much more local than we think. It's much more local. And I think that the way in which China has been ruled and operated through the centuries, much more local than people think. We think of it as centralized control. But it was local situations which were viable, which people could live in and support themselves, and yet be in connection with other units that were similar without necessarily having the umbrella. So I see the Great Circle as a miraculous, functioning unit. Nobody's in control. Nobody is in charge of it all. Never have been. It's always been the interrelationship of these small local units that worked for the local situation. And we're probably sometimes never aware that they were part of even this larger unit. They knew what went on locally, and yet those local units often could not have existed without this interrelationship across a wider area. So I believe in today's world with Buddhism that Buddhism has just expanded the Great Circle to the whole globe, and that nobody is really directing that. I mean, we have, of course, mandalas, and I consider Foguanshan as a perfect mandala. It has its local base. It has its situation, and you're fortunate. You have a wonderful master who helps develop this mandala and attracts attention and attracts support. But when you look at how that interrelates with Theravada Buddhism, with Tibetan Buddhism, with Japanese Buddhism, with Vietnamese Buddhism, it does. And you have connections, you have ties, you have things which you share. And that those shared items hold it together. But that all of us who participate in the Buddhist tradition are really participating in this great circle of interconnectedness. So I love to think about Indra's net, and Buddhism is a perfect Indra's net. It's the connections, but there's also all those knots that make up the net itself. So it's both local and universal.
A system of systems, each having its own function. Yet each of the system has the freedom to develop in the way it wants. I feel like I'm visualizing the illustration of the Indra's net based on the law of interconnection, now kind of coming alive in our mind, and perhaps in the future in a virtual rendition. And so this indeed is that great circle that continues to expand and is ever-changing and so diverse. my next question to follow up on the diversity and the ever-changing nature of this circle is that, as you have said, it involves all kinds of people. So people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of language, yet they're all connected back to the same root. I'm quite interested in how could Buddhism be taught to people who didn't actually share the language of India? I mean, today we all speak a different type of language, which probably do not share that same root in the language tree. So how do people manage to learn if they didn't really speak the language of the Buddha?
I think you can go back all the way to the time of the Buddha and see how he taught. He was on the trade routes between the urban areas in the Ganges basin. These small urban centers were connected through trade with one another, but they had different dialects. And I'm sure that Buddhism was already being translated into another dialect by the Buddha himself, that he spoke a number of these dialects because he traveled almost 200 miles. In India at that time, to go 100 miles, you had innumerable numbers of dialects that you ran into. So it started with even the founder himself having to translate. But one of the things which developed in Buddhism was a clear statement that the Dharma, the teaching, is the way things really are. And therefore, you ought to be able to say that in any language. You're not talking about something which is limited just to India or just to China. No language area is the center of all this knowledge. If it's true that the Dharma is just the way things are, then of course it should be able to be said, and it was, and people believed that. And so, of course, in the midst of all this, along came writing for the first time in India. So just as the maritime work was developing, Mahayana arose, the textual tradition of Mahayana arose with it in writing. And once you have it in writing, then you could take the written word and translate it. And you can translate it into any language. So the Buddhist tradition was one in which translations must have been going on all the time. The merchant who moved from one port to another, he had to learn some kind of way to communicate with the people in that other port. So the merchant and his family were already, in a sense, doing translation work. So the Buddhist tradition is that part of the interaction that occurred was translation, and that it was possible in any language to express the reality of the teachings of the Buddha. That there is suffering. There's a cause of suffering. There is something which brings suffering to an end. Just those basic Buddhist traditions, they're translatable. You can translate that. People understand it. You're talking about the human condition. And as long as you're speaking of the human condition, then people understand what you're talking about. It's when the tradition becomes very abstract and seems to be divorced from the human condition that people say, well, it's just so complicated. I don't quite understand. I don't know what that word means, or I can't follow this kind of convoluted explanations. It's not that the explanations are wrong if they're complex. The Buddhists were great debaters. They debated with each other for centuries. Debate was not considered something evil. It was a way to learn. It was a way to test your knowledge. It was a way to make your knowledge stronger. The stronger you could defend it, the stronger your message. So yes, we were struggling. If you want to look at it from that way, the Buddhist tradition struggled with language, but it had a way of dealing with it. And it allowed people to hear the message, deal with the message. So no wonder that part of the Buddhist textual world are made up of stories, Jataka tales, avadanas. These are ways to let people know what the teaching is. And you can tell those stories in any language. They make sense. People can understand them. People can enjoy them. So I understand your question. How in the world could you do this? Well, they did it.
Thank you, Professor. To make sure that language actually works with us in our learning and understanding of the Dharma, and that it does not work against us. But certainly the Buddhist masters, their translation works throughout history have served as an extremely important and beautiful instrument to aid us in understanding what the Buddha was actually teaching. And so in your book, you've also mentioned the spread of Buddhism through the media of translated text. So thank you very much for this. My next question is regarding marine archaeology. As we speak of maritime Buddhism, we are always being asked the question, how do you know? How can you see? So since sailing ships leave no permanent mark on the ocean, and in India, there's not much written history of the time when the maritime route was first used. So how can we know much about maritime Buddhism?
In one sense, the written record, as you've mentioned, does not exist. So there's silence from that quarter. So when I started to work on the maritime, the first thing which alerted me to it was to go to the Archaeological Survey Office in Chennai and read the archaeological notes of people who had been out in Tamil Nadu and Kerala states making archaeological digs and what they found, so that you begin to try to figure out what data can I use. So a lot of it is archaeological. We have archaeological digs that are filled with objects which we can identify as Buddhist. They have images. But sometimes what we find in an archaeological dig is a glass bead. So what are you going to do with a glass bead? How can you take a glass bead and make any statement about the way in which Buddhism or activity was going on? When you analyze that glass bead, and there were many of them, it was a medium of exchange, and they were made from sand, but they were silica, but to get it hot enough to melt it into a glass bead was beyond anybody's ability in early days. But then they discovered that if they added what's called flux, they added ash or soda to the mix, it would dissolve much faster and at a lower temperature. So we could take a glass bead and analyze its chemistry. So I've been working on looking again at Malaysian ports and reading about the discovery of a place where there are glass beads. When we analyze those glass beads, lo and behold, it turns out that the flux which was used in those glass beads came from one spot in Egypt. And that already tells you a lot. If you find a brick, you can now determine within a few years of when that brick was fired. That's amazing new technology. When they found wooden Buddha images in the mud in Mekong Delta of Vietnam, and they put them through the carbon-14 test, they were able to determine that these images were 1,500 years old. And they've been buried in mud for centuries because the mud is anorexic. It draws the oxygen out of things. And lo and behold, those wooden images survived. So when we began to gather data, it's enormous amount of data. We found an image of the one that you have on the shown there on the front of the book, Avalokiteshvara. They allowed them to take a tiny piece of that image and analyze it. And it was made of iron that came from a specific place in India, and it was made with lead that came from the Mediterranean. So even that image that we have on the front of the book is one that gives us information which written records would probably never have told us, that the world of trade all the way from the Mediterranean to East Asia was real and was going on, and those things were being exchanged. So even though nobody gives us a record, we can go back and say, this was related to something that belongs to another place. And while the sea leaves no trace, we know pretty much exactly where they sailed because we know they sailed on monsoon winds. And the monsoon wind pattern has not changed that much. We still have it. Every year it comes. We can go out there and track the monsoon wind pattern, and we know how those merchants moved from one port to another and when they moved from those ports. So this is how we gather the data to tell us more and more about how Buddhism was spread. So what we look for is an archaeological dig, an object, and anything which indicates that Buddhism was there. And then we try to put together the story.
Thank you, Professor. That was indeed very interesting. As we hear of the saying, a mustard seed can contain the entire chiliocosm or the entire multiverse, what you have said shows us the entire universe, well, the entire earth within a single glass bead. And it has so many traces within itself. So this is definitely a very amazing thing. Now, the next question moves us further into China. Chinese Buddhism was founded in the Han Dynasty in Chang'an. So the question is Maritime Buddhism in the south that entered through Guangzhou of much importance?
This is something which I feel very strongly about. When I started working on the maritime idea and the fact that it was the Buddhism which came through Guangzhou that was a significant part of the maritime activity. I was in China and speaking to people in Beijing, and they said, no, you're wrong. The Buddhism came through the north, had nothing to do with the south. And that's an old blind spot sometimes in Chinese history. The south has always been discounted. It was a place of jungles, and it was far from the court, and it was looked at as something that was where you sent people in exile. It wasn't a good place. But if you look at what came through Guangzhou in terms of present-day Chinese Buddhism, you can only understand Chinese Buddhism today and the practices that you see if you know very well what passed in through Guangzhou. If you are dependent only upon what came into Chang'an and the texts and the traditions and even the practices that came into Chang'an, I don't think you can explain very much about what you see in Chinese Buddhism today. Chinese Buddhism today is dominated by the Chan monastic tradition of Bodhidharma, who came through Guangzhou. Chinese Buddhism today is very much involved with Yogacara, with mind-only school of thought, which came through Guangzhou. Chinese Buddhism today is a Guanyin tradition, which is more dominant even than the Buddha, if you will. And Guanyin, everybody is trying to figure out, when did Avalokiteshvara become Guanyin? You can only understand that, I think, by looking at the sea, not the land. And people have struggled for decades trying to explain how Avalokiteshvara could become a feminine goddess from the northern tradition, and it will never work. Avalokiteshvara was god of the sea. He was the patron saint of sailors. We see this in Sri Lanka. Every Sri Lankan ancient river port had an image of Avalokiteshvara looking out to sea. So when Avalokiteshvara and the idea of him as the sea god arrived in Guangzhou, there already was a sea goddess, Matsu. And people said, well, which one is right? And other people said, you don't understand. Avalokiteshvara can show himself in many forms. He doesn't have to show himself just as you see with that golden image on the front of the book. You can see him as that white-clothed Guanyin. So that I think when we see something like that, we understand that the Guanyin tradition of Buddhism developed from the seaports, that Chan and Bodhidharma from the seaports, and even the presence of Buddhist nuns in China came by sea from Sri Lanka. That once we began to look at everything which those maritime Buddhist teachers were bringing into China, that's where we'll find the explanations for the Buddhism which we see in China today. So I look at you, Venerable, you're a Chan monastic. I believe that you are a firm devotee of Guanyin. I think that you are also very much involved with the mind-only tradition. All of the things which, and you are a fully ordained bhikshuni. So that says to me that you in yourself represent a living image of the Southern Maritime Buddhism, if I could be so bold.
I agree fully. That is totally true. It also gives me a clearer image of where I actually came from as I became a student of Venerable Master who inherited from the Lingji tradition. It really says a lot. So, Professor, you shared a lot of information about the type of Buddhism that was carried through China, through the sea route. And so in your book, it's divided into 5 chapters, which I wish we had the time to cover today. But to quickly give our audience an idea of the scope of the book, the first chapter gives an introduction to the cross-regional connections of Buddhism in Eurasia. And while the second chapter talks about the origin and spread of Buddhism. And the third chapter discusses the Great Circle of Buddhism and its rim. And then the fourth chapter brings us along the sea routes for us to discover the earlier traits of, early Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Tantra Buddhism, as well as Reformed Theravada Buddhism. We can all see this in the table of contents. And then coming to the conclusion about the Buddhist expansion in a mandala-like structure. There's already a lot packed in this book that I'm sure will spark a lot of interest. And there's really a lot more to be said. So I hope today is only the starting point of our exploration of maritime Buddhism together. But I have one last question for you. You've spent a lot of years and a lot of your efforts into completing this book and to bring forth the new media exhibition. But as you have said, there are probably a lot more to be done. In my last question for you, what has been the biggest challenge for this Maritime Buddhism project? And is there a next step for you?
Yes, well, those are also very good questions. I think the biggest challenge that I faced was that I needed to find data to back up my assertions about the maritime tradition. And how was I to do that? So my first attempt to do that was, as I said, I decided to send out teams of young archaeologists with GPS, cameras, and a computer to all the places where the India Archaeological Survey of India had identified as having Buddhist remains. And I asked them to map them very precisely within a few meters, not just a dot on a map which could be 100 miles off. I wanted a very precise map. And so we did that. And when we looked at it, we found that the Buddhist sites in India, I at last had a little data. It was new data. The Buddhist sites clustered at seaports. And a thin line of Buddhist sites ran up the rivers from the seaports into the hinterland, usually on one shore or one side of the river or the other, not on both sides, just one side. Fewer dots on the river than at the seaports. And when you went to the land roads, fewer dots still. So that was a big challenge for me, was to try to get that data to the point where I had something to back up my assertions about the presence of Buddhism in the world of seaports and sea trade. And it proved to be that when our teams came back, it was very obvious that this was the case. Then I tried to figure out, how can I put together data which will show what Buddhism looked like all across the seaport route? And that's when I worked with Sarah Kenderdine, Professor Kenderdine, who was then at the University of New South Wales in Australia and is now at Lausanne in Switzerland. What an incredible job she did. She spent 90 days out there with a camera crew every day, taking pictures with surround cameras, with 360-degree cameras at high resolution, and created this enormous collection of visual data from one seaport to another, from archaeological sites, so that has become a major kind of data. I hope in the future to expand that. I hope we can go to phase 2. We need to do more filming in China. We need to do filming in Japan and Korea. And, but I want to say how much I owe to other people for helping me gather this kind of data. Professor Dayalan at the India Office Research Center in Chennai, Sarah Kenderdine. And then when it came time to put it all together, Sarah and I said to ourselves one day when we met in Sydney, in fact, we want to make this available to the general public, not just a scholarly audience. This is important enough that we think we need to figure out ways to let the Buddhist public understand and know what we're talking about. And that's when Jeffrey Shaw came in from CityU and put together that incredible exhibit that you now have at the Buddha Museum. I haven't done any of this by myself. It's been teamwork. It's been your help. It's been the help of Venerable Ru Chan. And always behind it has been the fact that all of what you've done at the Buddha Museum goes back to Master Xingyun and his visions. He's had a similar kind of vision, I think, all his life. That Buddhism is not just limited to a specific thing or place. And that Buddhism is not just one type, but it has local variations. And those are okay. You can let it be local as well as international, as well as global. So we're still trying to collect data. And I appreciate all the work that other scholars have done. I read their work and I stand on their shoulders. And I don't by any means wish to say that this is just something which I could have done myself with just what I know. It took every kind of discipline that I could find to find any kind of data. So when I tell granddaughters jokes, but when I talk to one of my granddaughters about working with a single bead to make data for my work, it sounded a little funny to her, but that's what we have to do sometimes if we don't have any other information. So it's a challenge, but the future, I think, is very bright. And I now believe that younger people, I hope, will continue this work, make it better, do it better than I have done, make it more precise. And I really appreciate the fact that the Buddha Museum has allowed us to do what we wanted to do And we have had 600,000 people looking at that exhibit. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. In what you have said, I see vow, I see passion, but I also see methodology and precision in a team that you have put together in order to bring forth what we see today. An interdisciplinary, but a huge historical effort for the world to begin to see Buddhism in a very different way. But like you have said, there's a lot of work yet to be done. And I'm sure whoever comes on board in the future will feel this great amount of pride and privilege as we have felt in having been a part of this picture with you. So thank you for giving us the privilege to be a part of the picture. And thank you for giving us the privilege to hear about your new book today. We wish the time could be longer. But based on what you have shared today, it has been an eye-opening experience to understand the extensive spread of Buddhism up to the 19th century along the sea route. And more importantly, I think the mandala spread fits very well to what we are witnessing in the 21st century today as well. Though there is no single central dominance over the global spread of Buddhism, it nevertheless enables the concurrent flourishment of all Buddhist traditions across the world. Yet we are all connected by the same root that makes us one. It has also been very interesting to see where we go from here. So thank you again so much for your time. We would like to express our deepest gratitude for your vow and effort. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
And before we say goodbye, I have some information to share with you. The Chinese panel of the book launch by Venerable Ru Chang, director of the Foguangshan Buddha Museum, as well as curator of the Buddhist Maritime Silk Road New Media Exhibition, alongside Professor Huang Xingya from National Sun Yat-sen University, who participated in the Chinese translation of the book, is available on the YouTube link shown here. And so you get to hear a slightly different perspective, but under the same scope of question you have heard today. And we're also very happy to announce that the ebooks for both the Chinese and English edition are now available on academia.edu as well as Google Books. But if you like the printed edition, please also click on the link on the description box below for details on how to order a physical copy from Taiwan. Last but not least, the Buddhist Maritime Silk Road New Media Exhibition is open until May 2026 at the Foguangshan Buddha Museum in Taiwan. And so make sure you swing by if you begin your travel plans again. And so that's it for today's book launch session. Thank you again to Dr. Lancaster. Thank you, everyone. And before we close, Professor Lancaster, would you like to say a few more words with the audience?
Well, I appreciate the interest that anybody has in wanting to read the book. It's made up of lectures that I gave. And so it's not your normal academic book. It's anecdotal, and it's a mixture of what you do orally when you present your case. So I'm happy that you have a chance to read it, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sure the readers will enjoy it. Actually, I myself get stopped at Foguangshan frequently because of the book. After we started to share the book, many people came up to me wanting to express their gratitude to you for making this book very easy to read, and also a very enjoyable discovery journey to how they now look at the spread of Buddhism very differently. And so please don't miss out on the book. And Professor has very compassionately made this book readily available on the internet. So don't miss out on the opportunity. And so that's it for us today. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to have more opportunities to also hear from Professor Shaw as well as Professor Kenderdine on their journey of maritime Buddhism. May the Buddha bless you. So thank you very much. Goodbye.